I've built an evil empire of language learning books that are slowly taking over the world. In bookstores from Boston to Bangkok, you'll find my books on the shelves. And like all supervillains, I've masterminded the entire thing completely by myself. Yeah, Ollie speaking. Oh, hi Sarah. Doesn't work for you? You think we should give some credit to the hundreds of people who have worked on each book? Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, thanks. Maybe just forget the evil genius thing. I'll keep that between us. How about instead I tell you about exactly how a normal guy like me manages to publish over 20 books in just a few years. Who helps me make the books? How we decide which languages to make? Why I don't even get involved until the halfway point, and how you might be able to work with us if you want. Sarah, I might need a bit of help to explain this. Would you mind?
Hi there, I am Sarah Cole. I am the publishing director for John Murray Languages, and I publish under the imprints of Teach Yourself and Michelle Thomas.
Okay, tell you what, let's start off with how we met in the first place, just to, set the scene.
How the whole Readers series came about is I was looking for new areas to extend our series, and Readers seemed like an obvious one that we weren't doing. And I was looking at the Penguin Readers and different things out there, and I was hanging out on Amazon, and I noticed this guy, Olly Richards, who had self-pubbed these readers and had excellent reviews and many stars, and I thought, I can't actually compete with him. So why don't I just ask him to be our author? And that's when I reached out to you and did my darndest to try to convince you, let us publish your books. And you made me work hard for it. But I think it's kind of the dream team.
And by the way, if you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Olly Richards, and this channel is all about helping you to learn a new language and explore the world through the power of story. And in case you're not familiar with these books that we're talking about here, I'll put a link in the description where you can see all of them in one place. Okay, now look, Sarah, my Instagram is inundated with people asking me if we're going to make such and such a language next. So let's talk about the decision-making process. Tell us how the discussion goes that leads to the decision, hey, let's make this book in this new language.
How we decide to continue with the series is based on the success of the overall series. And this set of books is selling incredibly, incredibly well. And so what we did is we started with kind of the languages we knew would do really well. And then after that, we said, well, let's try some languages that perhaps aren't learned as much. And they succeeded as well. So now the idea is to really grow it across as many languages as we can and just see if eventually at some point there's a drop off. But so far, it's just been received so well online, in stores. So we just keep on going with it, essentially.
It all starts with who gets to make the decision. We're going to publish a book in, I don't know, Bulgarian, and you may be surprised to hear it's not me making the decision.
It's based on a lot of things when we decide to publish a new book. So it is the decision of the publishing director or the commissioning editor to propose a new book in a series or, a new series in general. That then goes to what's called an acquisitions meeting. And then it's really up to the managing director, the sales team, the marketing team to get behind it and decide.
Publishing a new book is always a huge investment, and lots of people play a part in the decision. We look at things like competitors, other books in the market, but luckily with this series, it's made a lot easier at this point because it's already established. Isn't that right?
With your series, the short story series, I can basically just show up and say, we want to do these languages, and they're probably going to say, okay, because they've been so successful. You do have to do due diligence, however.
Yes, and what that means is they have to look at data of sales to see what the sell-through is. And there are actually two customers to think about. There is what leaves the warehouse and sells to the bookstores. And then on the other hand, there is what customers actually buy at the till. And so all of this work leads up to the approval of the book. And that's always an exciting day when that happens. I always get an email from Sarah chock full of exclamation marks. But the truth is, the work has only just begun at this point, and it's quite surprising what the next step in the process is. And no, it is not subscribing to Olly's YouTube channel, because of course everyone at Teach Yourself is already subscribed, right guys? Believe it or not, the next step is that Sarah has to sell the book to her own people, internal PR. That's right, she has to get everyone at the publishers, the sales team, the marketing team, really excited about the new book, because these are the people who are ultimately going to be selling it. Okay, let's say we've decided on Japanese. What happens next?
we say, okay, well, how are we going to adapt the template, and what is unique about this language, and how do we have to change things so that it'll work for a beginning learner? So for example, how are we going to use furigana to help the learner, and how we level it, and then we try and bring in experts.
That's right, it's time to bring in the experts and also the non-experts. That's when I get involved, because each language has very unique features and some very difficult decisions have to be made. Like, for example, which form of the past tense to use in a French or Italian book. Often these are decisions where you know you're going to be criticized either way, whatever editorial decision you make. And this is where I've actually been very grateful for the story learning community, because it's often been you guys who have looked at early samples of stories and help me make these difficult decisions from time to time. But anyway, back to the real experts. First, there is Rebecca, our editorial consultant. Her expertise is graded readers, so she is responsible for ensuring each book is properly graded at the appropriate level. Next, we bring in development editors and translators, but this is not just a simple translation task. We have very carefully selected people who are also teachers of the language.
You could say, I'll just bring in a translator, but unless you're aware of what the learner needs and how to level it, you could come up with a very different product. So we always work with teachers of that language. And then we go through a process of translation and checking and things like that.
Next up is the copy editor. This is the person who is basically another set of eyes who checks the finer points for accuracy. They then do what's called coding the manuscript to make sure it is digital friendly. Because remember, we don't just have printed books here, there are also ebooks and the audios as well. More on that later. Anyway, after this, it goes into what is called proofs. And that is when the manuscript goes to the typesetter and it comes back as a PDF or an InDesign file. And this always goes perfectly smoothly with no problems whatsoever.
So, little spoiler alert, when Japanese came back in first proofs, huge areas of the text were actually missing. So we had to send it back. And thankfully, we had an excellent proofreader who caught that. But when you're working with foreign script, these sorts of things happen. So you have to be exceptionally careful when you're checking them.
This was an interesting learning process for me, because when I actually teach languages in my own story learning courses, I often change, upgrade, even re-record entire lessons based on student feedback. But with books, it's a different story. You've only got one chance to get a book right. So let's quickly pause to look at the core editorial team and their roles. We have the director of publishing. Their job is acquiring new books, new titles. Once that's acquired, it goes to editorial management. That's the editorial manager and the project editors. They're responsible for the schedules of the books and keeping the publishing date on track. And these editors themselves often work with freelancers, like the development editor or a consultant. Why freelancers? Well, it's like I said before, there are many languages that we work with, and it's never possible to have every expert in every role in every language in-house inside the company. So this is where our freelancers get to have some fun, and how you also might be able to contribute to that. More on that later. Hold on, so how does the whole translation process actually work then?
So we rely on an extensive freelance database to find our experts. And that's when we have, for this series, we have a translator come in. They do a sample before we agree. So sometimes we'll have several people be the translators, and then we decide on one. That translator then works very closely with the development editor, and that person is usually a teacher, and they will review the translation to make sure it's at the appropriate level, it's accurate, it's engaging, it makes sense, things like that. In this case, we also have a freelance consultant who kind of comes in and advises these two people on the readers.
Slightly more complex with a language like Japanese, of course. A lot of people are working on it. Once the development editor is happy with the content, it comes back in-house and the project editor then checks it. Next up is the copy editor, who submits it and then codes it. And then finally, the book goes into production. And then we have a proofreader who's checking the files every step of the way. And don't forget the project editor, because, well, they are still there overseeing every single stage. And we must not forget our production colleagues, who are essential to everything. They work with the typesetters, with the printers, making sure the books arrive on time, and they also help with the ebook conversion. Whew. Still with me? Well, I'm about to tell you how long this whole process takes. I mean, any guesses? Now, believe it or not, and you probably will by this point, it takes quite a long time to just get one new book out.
The timeline for a book being published can vary, but because of the complexity of working in foreign languages, I think it's probably around 15 months, although my production colleagues might beg to differ.
15 months? I think I'll let Sarah explain this one.
Essentially, the process starts with the development of the manuscript, and that can be anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, depending on the complexity of it, the availability of the development editors and the translators, and the number of rounds and reviews that has to go through. Once it hits production and is handed over, it's about 9 months between when that manuscript goes into production to when we have a final book.
Well, that is a long process, and I believe even proofs can take up to 5 rounds. But once everybody is happy with it, it then finally goes to the typesetter, and then at last it gets printed and bound into what we know today. But how long this takes depends on where it's done.
It depends on where it is printed. So if it's printed in China, it's going to take quite a while to get to our warehouses in the US and the UK. But if it's printed locally in Europe, it can be a bit faster.
And even where we print the books can change.
This is an interesting one because sometimes it depends on the language and which market might be more eager for it. So in some cases, we want to publish in the US first. The US sales are amazing for this series. So we'll actually print it in the US, which is the case for Irish and Japanese. And that's about 4 to 5 weeks between printing and getting in the warehouse.
Yeah, so it depends on the language. It's interesting about Irish and Japanese being so in demand in the US, right? But then at long last, the books reach the warehouse ready to be shipped off worldwide. And that is my favorite part because I know you guys are all just waiting outside the bookstores in the rain, ready for stories in a new language, right? But wait, because there is more. As any story learning student will know, there is one thing you should always have when you're reading. As you've probably guessed, I'm talking about the audiobooks that match the stories. But here's the thing, we can only do the audio recordings once we are 110% certain that there aren't going to be any more changes to the manuscript. So now we are in the recording studio, there's a small team with an editor, a voice artist, and there's a lot to consider. Why is that, Sarah?
When we're doing audio, I think the most important decision is who the reader is, because they have to have the ability to speak clearly and naturally, but at a slower pace. And that's actually really hard to do so that they don't sound stilted. Like, je veux aller. You know, they have to speak like a native speaker. You have to make the connections and sounds, but you have to be so clear. And I think you also need to have a dynamic voice. You need to know what words to enunciate to help with clarity and meaning. It can't just be a flat reading. So we spend a lot of time listening to different voiceover artists. Ideally, they have experience in educational materials, which is often the case. And then we agree on one. And it's important that during the studio recording, we set really clear parameters, that we, if somebody starts speeding up or something like that, that we actually slow them down.
So this job is not as easy as it might seem. It makes sense that the audio has to be done so late in the process, but what problems are we avoiding this way?
So often you'll get into the studio and the native speaker will be reading something and they'll say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then you're like, oh, you're right. We did miss that word, because inevitably it happens. So then what we have to do is decide, do we change the audio? Can we change the proofs? Where are we in that stage of the process?
But now let's talk about the covers, because for me, the covers are my favorite things about these books. Still to this day, every time I walk into a bookshop and I see these beautiful covers staring back at me from the shelves, I still get goosebumps, and I think, are these really my books? It makes me very proud. And without these iconic covers, it just wouldn't be the same. So when we're starting with a blank canvas, who decides what the book covers will look like?
Good question about the covers, because I couldn't be happier with the covers for this series, and I do contribute the success to them as well. So the cover process works almost tangentially to the kind of editorial production process, where at a certain point, there's a critical path, is what it's called, that we follow, that at certain points you have to have your cover brief done, and then you have to have it confirmed, and all these things have to work together so that everything prints on time. So the way that it works is once the development has happened so that I actually understand what the book is, or what are the key features of it, I will then, or the commissioning editor will create a brief. And this brief will say what your vision is, what your aspiration is, what is the one thing or few things that you want people to immediately think when they look at this cover. So it's very kind of ephemeral, but then you get into the details and you start looking at the competition, and you start looking at other sources that perhaps have nothing to do with language learning but are beautiful. And you kind of consolidate that vision into a short little brief. That then goes to a cover meeting. And in that meeting are sales, marketing, design, the managing director, and all of them have a say in what this will be.
And then they get back different rough variations or concepts from one or two designers. And then it's time to perfect the design illustration, because the illustration might be cool, but it's not just about the illustration. There's a vital question to ask. What is the first thing we want people to see when they look at the book? And what's the perfect subtitle? How does it look as a thumbnail on a smartphone screen? There's a lot that goes into this. Guys, this is the fun part for me, and I think for all of us. It's looking at samples of the new short stories covers, and I suspect Sarah agrees.
One of the most fun things that we all have is looking at the new short stories cover. Because after a while, we have so many languages now. It's like, okay, I need a new idea. How can I make this distinctively Irish or Japanese? And it's always just a joy to see them come back and watch them grow.
The back and forth with covers is pretty crazy, to be honest. You should hear this. It's quite interesting.
When we start the process for a new book cover, the first thing I'll do, as you know, Olly, is send it to you. Because as the author and as somebody who speaks many languages, has traveled, I really need your input, make sure it's your vision. And also, because we're working in foreign languages, to make sure it's culturally appropriate, it's not overly stereotyped, we're picking out the right things to represent the country and the language. And then once I have sign off from the author and your input, it then goes to the cover briefing meeting.
And so what are we waiting for at this stage? First drafts?
In this case, we get sketches first that kind of just show what the layout will be. And if it's right, and we'll get different variations, and we'll say, no, that one's the strongest. And then we'll see the first draft come through. And so all of this goes to you. And, we're also looking at it's my view, it's your view, but it's also the translators, the development editors where appropriate, because they might live in the country, for example. So we really try and get as much consensus and input as possible. But ultimately, it has to be the vision of you, the author, and the publisher together.
And I certainly appreciate that invaluable input from these guys. So we now have the beautiful new books, and all that is left is to get them sold. After all, the whole point is to help you guys out there with your language adventures. And believe me, when it's taken this long to produce a book, I really, really, really want you to have it. Now, sales and marketing. What happens here? Well, while all of these other things were going on, all the information about these new books has been going into a database. It's the book description, keywords, cover files, various other metadata. That is the publisher's job. And this database is where the sales and marketing team can go in at any point and find all the information they need about the book. And this process starts way before the books are ever published.
So there are sales conferences where the publisher or the salesperson will present that to the sales team, because you will have a rep who just works with perhaps Waterstones and Barnes & Noble, and then you'll have the Amazon rep. And each of them have to understand what that book is, what makes it unique, and then sell it into the different sales channels.
Yes, and then they get together with all their marketing colleagues and work on a launch plan. And that means figuring out how to advertise the book on social media, how to promote it on Amazon, and so on. I believe it's particularly important to get those pre-sale numbers up on Amazon for rankings and all things like that. And still, these guys don't stop. They promote the books at conferences or try out traditional methods like putting books into, a language magazine. I wonder, is there anyone else that's important in this process?
I think crucially, it's working with you to help that plan, because you are the one who has such a big audience as well. So providing you with the assets, whether it's internal pages or covers early on to do teasers and just kind of let people know this is what's coming. So we put a whole plan in place and we put a budget around that, and then we go for it.
Well, it is good to hear that I am not completely useless in all this. Now, for someone out there who's thinking about writing a language book, they may be looking at my books and wondering, well, what makes this series so successful, and how can I write a successful language book myself? So, Sarah, what in your mind as director of publishing has made these books do so well?
The success of these books have exceeded my expectations. I'm quite in awe of it. I think it was the perfect combination of content, cover design, author, and a very clear and easy proposition for the end user, which is the learner.
Now, as I promised earlier, what if you would like to get involved? What if you are a language expert or a translator, perhaps? How does a freelancer strike up a working relationship with a publisher like Teach Yourself?
When we start working with freelancers, they're often in a database that we've kind of accumulated over the years. And we definitely go with the ones that sort of know our books, know our series, because it makes our job easier. They're almost like an extension to our internal team. That said, because we publish in so many languages, and because we're actually trying to expand into different languages, it becomes really challenging to find somebody who can proofread Swahili for us, because it's not just knowing the language, it's knowing how to teach the language and catching things like that, and understanding the pedagogy behind it. So we are always active in searching for new freelancers and new talent. And even conferences, we have like, come work for us, give us your information. So there are email addresses on our books through social media, through Facebook. If anybody has a language background and a passion and has a teaching background as well, then we want to hear from you, because funnily enough, we even struggle sometimes to find French proofreaders and copy editors and development editors as well. So it's not a closed door by any means. It's actually a very wide open door.
And if you have one of my books and you would like some tips to get even more out of it, then you should watch this video where I show you the right way to learn and memorize all that new vocabulary that you learn in the books. Just click that video right over here.